Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the exploration ship New Horizon and watched the stars shift from white streaks back to steady points of light as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations while Jake studied the readouts on his command screen. They had been traveling for 6 months from Earth, and this was their final destination before turning back home. The mission was simple enough. Survey this star system and look for anything interesting that might benefit humanity back on Earth. Lieutenant Danny Walsh looked up from the navigation console and turned toward Jake. His young face showed excitement mixed with the tiredness that came from months in deep space. Danny had joined the crew fresh from the academy, and this was his first long mission beyond the solar system. He pointed at his screen where green dots showed the positions of planets around the local star. The star system had 7 planets, but only one caught their attention right away. The third planet from the star glowed with a soft blue light that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. Dr. Lisa Hayes ran her scientific scanners from the science station, and her equipment started showing readings that made no sense at all. The planet had cities that stretched across entire continents and energy signatures that were far beyond anything humans had ever built. Jake ordered the ship to move closer to the planet while keeping their distance. As they approached the strange world, Dr. Hayes called out from her station with growing amazement in her voice. The cities on the planet's surface were made from some kind of crystal material that seemed to grow like living things. Towers reached up toward space in perfect spirals that caught and reflected the light from the star in ways that created rainbow patterns. Across the sky, the communications officer Maria Santos suddenly straightened up at her station. Her equipment was picking up signals from the planet, and after a few minutes of analysis, she turned to face Jake with wide eyes. The signals were clearly artificial and showed intelligence, but they were unlike anything in human databases. The mathematical patterns in the transmission suggested a civilization that thought about numbers and science in completely different ways than humans did. Jake made the decision to try making contact. He ordered Maria to broadcast standard first contact protocols toward the planet, while keeping the ship ready to jump away if anything went wrong. Within minutes, they received a response that made everyone on the bridge stop what they were doing and stare at the main screen. The reply came in perfect English with only the slightest accent that sounded like music, mixed with wind chimes. A voice spoke from the communication system with politeness that seemed genuine and welcoming. The speaker identified themselves as Ambassador Kyreth and said they had been expecting human visitors for some time. They invited the New Horizon to orbit their world and offered to send a delegation to meet with the human crew. Jake accepted the invitation while wondering how these aliens had learned to speak English and why they had been expecting humans at all. The delegation that came aboard the New Horizon 3 hours later left the entire crew speechless. The beings called themselves Xenarathi, and they looked like humans might look if humans were made from living starlight. They stood about 7 feet tall with slender builds and faces that seemed carved from the finest crystal. Their skin glowed with soft internal light that shifted between silver and pale blue colors. When they moved, they seemed to flow rather than walk, and their voices carried harmonics that made even simple words sound like music. Ambassador Kyreth led the delegation and wore robes that seemed to be woven from captured moonbeams. The ambassador explained that the Xenarathi had been observing human space travel for decades and had learned human languages from intercepted communications. They were curious about humanity and wanted to establish peaceful relations between their species. Jake invited the delegation to the main conference room where both sides could sit and talk more formally. The Xenarathi moved through the ship corridors with obvious interest in human technology, but they seemed more puzzled than impressed. Dr. Hayes noticed that the aliens showed particular confusion when looking at medical equipment and life support systems. It was as if the very concept of maintaining biological functions was foreign to them. During the formal meeting, Kyreth explained that the Xenarathi civilization was very old and had spread across several star systems in this region of the galaxy. They had encountered other alien species before but found humans uniquely interesting. When Jake asked why humans were different, Kyreth paused for a long moment as if searching for the right words. The ambassador finally said that humans seemed to live with an intensity and urgency that other species lacked. The cultural exchange began immediately with both sides eager to learn about each other. The Zenarathi showed holographic displays of their cities and explained how their crystal technology worked by harmonizing with natural energy fields. Everything they built seemed to grow rather than being constructed, and their society appeared to function without any visible conflict or competition. Jake found himself wondering how any civilization could be so peaceful and perfect. Dr. Hayes asked about Zenarathi biology and received answers that challenged everything she knew about life science. The Zenarathi explained that their bodies were sustained by direct energy conversion rather than biological processes. They did not need food or water or sleep in the way humans understood these things. When she asked about their lifespans, Karith gave her a look of confusion and said that lifespans were not relevant to their species. The conversation continued through what would have been dinner time for the humans. Jake mentioned that they should probably break for a meal and invited the Zenarathi to join them in the ship dining hall. The aliens accepted politely but seemed puzzled by the concept of scheduled eating. In the dining hall, the Zenarathi watched with fascination as the humans consumed physical food and seemed to enjoy the social aspects of sharing a meal together. It was during dinner that Jake made an offhand comment that would change everything between the two species. He mentioned his grandfather, who had been a pilot during Earth early space exploration days. Jake talked about how his grandfather's stories about flying among the stars had inspired him to join the space service and eventually become a ship captain. He said his grandfather had passed away 3 years ago, but that his influence still guided Jake's decisions every day. The moment Jake finished speaking, every Zenarathi in the room went completely silent. Kyrith leaned forward with an expression of deep confusion and asked Jake to repeat what he had just said. When Jake repeated the story about his grandfather, Kyrith asked what the phrase "passed away" meant. The question hung in the air like a physical thing, and Jake realized he was about to explain death to beings who had apparently never encountered the concept before. Jake Morrison stared at the confused faces of the Zenarathi delegation and realized he was about to attempt something no human had ever done before. How do you explain death to beings who have never died? How do you describe the end of existence to creatures who might have lived for thousands of years? He took a deep breath and tried to find simple words for the most complex truth of human existence. Ambassador Kyrith waited patiently for Jake to answer the question about what passed away meant. The other Zenarathi at the table leaned forward with expressions of genuine curiosity, mixed with something that looked almost like concern. Dr. Lisa Hayes watched the exchange with growing fascination while Maria Santos kept her recording equipment running to capture every word of this historic conversation. Jake decided to start with the most basic explanation he could manage. He told Kyrith that when humans get very old or very sick, their bodies stop working and they die. Death meant that the person stopped existing forever and could never come back. Their body would decay and return to the earth while their consciousness simply ended like a light being turned off. He explained that his grandfather had lived for 87 years before his heart stopped beating, and he died peacefully in his sleep. The silence that followed Jake's explanation lasted for nearly a full minute. Kyrith finally spoke in a voice that carried notes of confusion and something that might have been distress. The ambassador asked if humans had tried to repair Jake's grandfather when his heart stopped working. When Jake explained that human technology could not bring back the dead, Kyrith asked why humans had not simply built a replacement for the grandfather. This question revealed the vast gap between human and Zenarathi understanding of existence. Jake tried to explain that humans were not machines that could be repaired or replaced. Each human was unique with their own memories and personality and experiences that made them who they were. When someone died, all of that uniqueness was lost forever, and no amount of technology could recreate what had been lost. Dr. Hayes joined the conversation to provide a more scientific explanation of human mortality. She described how human cells aged and broke down over time and how the human body eventually became unable to sustain life. She explained that death was built into human biology as a natural process that every human would eventually experience. The Zenarathi listened to her explanation with growing amazement, as if she was describing something completely alien to their understanding of how life should work. Kyrith asked Dr. Hayes to examine Zenarathi biology to understand how their species was different from humans. The ambassador allowed Dr. Hayes to run her medical scanners on Zenarathi physiology and the results were unlike anything in human scientific databases. The Xenarathi showed no signs of cellular aging or biological decay. Their energy-based bodies appeared to be completely stable with no indication that they would ever break down or cease to function. The revelation that the Xenarathi were essentially immortal beings led to hours of discussion. Between the two species, Jake found himself trying to explain concepts that humans took for granted, but that were completely foreign to immortal minds. He talked about how the knowledge of death affected every aspect of human life and gave urgency to human actions and relationships. Maria Santos shared stories about human culture and how awareness of mortality shaped human art and music and literature. She explained that humans created things specifically because they knew their time was limited, and they wanted to leave something behind that would outlast their brief lives. The Xenarathi found this concept fascinating but struggled to understand why beings would create art about sadness and loss when they could create art about eternal joy instead. The conversation turned to human emotions, and particularly the emotion of grief that humans experienced when someone they loved died. Jake tried to describe the pain of losing his grandfather, and how that pain mixed with gratitude for the time they had shared together. He explained that grief was not just sadness, but also a way of honoring the memory of someone who could not be replaced. Kireth asked why humans would choose to form emotional bonds with other humans if those bonds would inevitably cause pain when death separated them. This question struck at the heart of human existence, and Jake found himself struggling to put into words something that felt as natural as breathing. He finally explained that love was worth the risk of loss and that the temporary nature of human relationships made them more precious rather than less valuable. Dr. Hayes attempted to explain human reproduction and how new humans were created to replace those who died. The Xenarathi found this concept particularly puzzling because they apparently reproduced by some form of energy division that created new individuals without the need for biological processes. The idea that human children started as helpless beings who required years of care and education before becoming independent was completely foreign to their experience. Lieutenant Danny Walsh joined the discussion to talk about human dreams and ambitions and how the limited nature of human life drove people to achieve great things. He explained that humans often worked their entire lives toward goals they might not live to see completed, but that they pursued anyway, because the work itself gave meaning to their existence. The Xenarathi listened with growing fascination to this description of beings who could find purpose in temporary endeavors. The cultural exchange continued for several more days as both species tried to bridge the gap between mortality and immortality. The Xenarathi delegation remained aboard the New Horizon to continue their studies of human behavior, while Jake crew worked to understand Xenarathi civilization. Each conversation revealed new aspects of how differently the two species viewed existence and meaning and purpose. One evening, while standing in the ship observation lounge, Jake and Kireth watched the stars together through the large viewing windows. Kireth asked Jake if knowing about death made humans afraid to live their lives. Jake considered the question carefully before explaining that awareness of death actually made humans more brave rather than more fearful. Humans took risks and pursued dreams and loved deeply precisely because they knew their time was limited. Kireth responded by saying that the Xenarathi had never needed to be brave because they had never faced any real danger of loss. The ambassador wondered aloud if their immortality had actually made them weaker in some ways, by removing the urgency that seemed to drive human achievement and human connection. This admission marked a turning point in the relationship between the two species, as both sides began to see that each had something valuable to learn from the other. Engineer Pete Johnson had been working on the New Horizon engines for 12 years, and knew every bolt and circuit in the massive drive system. He was a quiet man from Nebraska who loved baseball and could fix any mechanical problem with nothing but spare parts and determination. On the morning that would change everything for both humans and Xenarathi, he was deep in the engine compartment replacing a faulty power coupling that had been giving the crew trouble for weeks. The Xenarathi delegation had been aboard the ship for 10 days and were beginning to understand some basic concepts about human mortality. They spent their time observing human behavior and asking endless questions about why humans did things that seemed to serve no logical purpose. Ambassador Kireth was particularly fascinated by human customs around food preparation and social gatherings. that appeared to waste time that could be spent on more productive activities. Pete was working alone in the engine room when the primary power coupling overloaded and sent a massive electrical surge through his body. The safety systems activated immediately, but the damage was already done. Pete collapsed beside the massive engine assembly, with his heart stopping from the electrical shock. The ship emergency alarms began wailing throughout all compartments, while automatic systems tried to restart his heart. With built-in medical equipment, Dr. Lisa Hayes received the emergency call and ran to the engine room with her medical kit and portable life support equipment. She found Pete unconscious on the deck with no pulse and severe electrical burns across his chest and arms. She immediately began emergency resuscitation procedures while calling for assistance from other crew members. The ship medical bay was 2 decks away and time was running out fast for any chance of saving Pete's life. Captain Jake Morrison arrived in the engine room, followed by several Xenarathi, including Ambassador Kyrith and scientist Velith, who had been studying human biology. The Xenarathi watched with confusion as Dr. Hayes worked frantically to restore Pete's heartbeat, using electrical stimulation and manual compression. They could not understand why the humans were so distressed about what appeared to be a simple mechanical failure in Pete's biological systems. Dr. Hayes managed to get Pete's heart beating again, and the crew rushed him to the medical bay where more advanced equipment could monitor his condition. For 3 hours, she worked to stabilize his vital signs while the Xenarathi observed from outside the medical bay. Pete regained consciousness briefly and spoke to Jake about making sure the engines were properly repaired before he lost consciousness again and his heart stopped for the final time. The moment when Dr. Hayes finally stopped her revival efforts and declared Pete dead was unlike anything the Xenarathi had ever witnessed. The humans in the medical bay showed immediate emotional reactions that ranged from tears to anger to a kind of quiet despair that seemed to fill the entire room. Jake knelt beside Pete's body and placed his hand on his friend's forehead while speaking words that the Xenarathi could not understand. The purpose of Kyrith approached Dr. Hayes and asked why she had stopped trying to repair Pete's biological functions. The ambassador suggested that perhaps Xenarathi technology could be used to restart Pete's systems and return him to normal operation. Dr. Hayes explained through her tears that Pete was beyond any help and that his consciousness had ended permanently. She told Kyrith that Pete was gone forever and would never speak or laugh or work on engines again. The concept of permanent ending finally became real for the Xenarathi as they watched the human crew deal with Pete's death. Jake called all crew members to the main ceremonial chamber, where Pete's body was placed on a platform surrounded by personal items that had belonged to him. The humans began what they called a funeral service, which the Xenarathi observed with growing fascination and confusion. Jake stood before the assembled crew and began speaking about Pete's life and accomplishments. He talked about Pete's childhood in Nebraska and his love of baseball and his skill with mechanical repairs. Jake described how Pete had saved the ship multiple times through his engineering expertise and how he had died doing the work he loved most. The other crew members took turns sharing their own memories of Pete and telling stories about his terrible jokes and his kindness to younger crew members. Dr. Hayes spoke about Pete's dedication to keeping the crew safe through his careful maintenance of all ship systems. Maria Santos shared a story about how Pete had helped her repair her personal communication equipment when she was homesick for Earth. Lieutenant Danny Walsh described how Pete had taught him to play poker and had always let him win when Danny was having a difficult day. The Xenarathi watched as every human in the chamber shed tears while speaking about Pete. They observed the complex mixture of sadness and gratitude and love that seemed to fill the room. During the ceremony, Kyrith asked Jake why the humans were performing these elaborate rituals for someone who could no longer hear or see what was happening. The ambassador could not understand the purpose of spending time and energy on activities that provided no benefit to Pete. Jake explained that the funeral was not for Pete, but for the living crew members who needed to say goodbye and honor their friend's memory. He told Kyrith that humans performed these rituals to help themselves accept the reality of loss and to celebrate the life that had ended. The ceremony was a way of ensuring that Pete would be remembered, even though he was gone forever. The funeral continued with the crew sharing Pete's favorite foods and playing music that he had enjoyed. They displayed photographs of Pete with his family on Earth and with his crewmates during their long journey through space. Each ritual seemed designed to capture and preserve memories of Pete while acknowledging that he would never create new memories again. After the formal ceremony ended, the crew spent hours talking informally about Pete and sharing more personal stories about their friendship with him. The Xenarathi observed how these conversations seemed to provide comfort to the humans, even though they also caused additional tears and expressions of grief. Kyrith began to understand that human mourning was not just about sadness but also about connection and love and the determination to keep someone's memory alive. That night the Xenarathi held their own private gathering to discuss what they had witnessed. For the first time in their long existence they had seen the end of a consciousness and observed how other beings dealt with permanent loss. Kyrith announced to the other Xenarathi that they would create their own ceremony to honor Pete Johnson, even though he had been a member of an alien species they had known for only a few days. The morning after Pete Johnson's funeral brought an unexpected request that surprised everyone aboard the New Horizon. Ambassador Kyrith approached Captain Jake Morrison with a proposal that no human had ever received from an alien species. 3 Xenarathi, including Kyrith, wanted to return to Earth with the human crew to continue studying mortality and what it meant to live with the knowledge of death. Jake listened to Kyrith's explanation with growing amazement. The ambassador said that witnessing Pete's death and the human response to loss had revealed something fundamental that the Xenarathi had never understood about existence itself. Kyrith believed that learning more about human mortality could help the Xenarathi understand aspects of life that their immortality had hidden from them for thousands of years. The other 2 Xenarathi, who wanted to join the human crew, were scientist Velith and cultural observer Thyros. Velith had been working with Dr. Lisa Hayes to understand human biology, and was fascinated by how the knowledge of limited lifespan affected human behavior and decision-making. Thyros had spent time with Maria Santos learning about human art and music and wanted to understand how awareness of death influenced human creativity. Jake agreed to take the 3 Xenarathi back to Earth after consulting with his crew and receiving approval from Earth Command. The journey home would take 8 months, which would give the aliens plenty of time to observe human life and culture. Jake assigned crew quarters to the 3 Xenarathi and began planning educational activities that would help them understand human mortality from every possible angle. The first few weeks of the return journey focused on basic human customs and traditions that the Xenarathi found completely puzzling. Dr. Hayes introduced them to the concept of birthdays, which were celebrations that marked humans getting older and closer to death. The idea that humans would celebrate aging seemed completely backwards to beings who viewed their eternal youth as the natural state of existence. Kyrith asked Dr. Hayes why humans celebrated getting older when aging brought them closer to the end of their lives. Dr. Hayes explained that birthdays were celebrations of time spent living and learning and growing as individuals. Each birthday marked another year of experiences and relationships and accomplishments that added meaning to human existence. The Xenarathi found this perspective fascinating, but struggled to understand why humans would voluntarily acknowledge their progression toward death. Lieutenant Danny Walsh introduced the Xenarathi to human photography and the practice of capturing moments in time to preserve them forever. He showed them pictures from his childhood and explained how photographs allowed humans to remember people and places and experiences that would otherwise fade from memory. The aliens were amazed by this human obsession with preserving temporary moments and asked why humans did not simply rely on their natural memory abilities. Danny explained that human memory was imperfect and faded over time just like human bodies aged and weakened. Photographs and videos and written records were ways that humans fought against the natural tendency of time to erase the past. By capturing important moments, humans could revisit them later and share them with others who had not been present during the original events. Maria Santos taught the Xenarathi about human music and poetry and how much of human artistic expression dealt with themes of love and loss and the passage of time. She played recordings of songs about missing someone who had died and poems about the beauty of temporary things like flowers and seasons. The Xenarathi listened with growing understanding as they began to see how awareness of mortality influenced every aspect of human culture. Thyros was particularly interested in human love songs and asked Maria why humans wrote so many songs about relationships that would inevitably end when one or both partners died. Maria explained that the temporary nature of human relationships made them more precious rather than less valuable. Knowing that time with someone you loved was limited made every moment together feel more important and meaningful. Dr. Hayes spent considerable time explaining human medicine and the ongoing battle that humans fought against disease and aging. She described how human doctors worked not just to cure illness, but to provide comfort and dignity to patients who were dying. The concept of palliative care that focused on reducing suffering rather than extending life was completely foreign to the Xenarathi understanding of medical treatment. The aliens asked why humans did not simply focus all their medical efforts on finding ways to achieve immortality like the Xenarathi had. Dr. Hayes explained that many humans did work toward extending human lifespan, but that others believed death was a natural part of life that should be accepted rather than fought. She told them about hospice care where humans helped dying people find peace and comfort. In their final days, Jake shared his personal philosophy about mortality during a late-night conversation in the ship observation lounge. He told Kyreth that knowing he would die someday did not make him sad or afraid, but rather motivated him to make his life count for something important. The limited nature of human existence forced people to choose carefully how they spent their time and encouraged them to focus on relationships and experiences that truly mattered. Kyreth asked Jake if he ever wished he could live forever like the Xenarathi. Jake considered the question seriously before answering that immortality might actually make life less meaningful rather than more valuable. He explained that having unlimited time might reduce the urgency that drove humans to accomplish great things and form deep connections with others. The knowledge that opportunities would not last forever pushed humans to seize important moments when they appeared. As the months passed, the three Xenarathi began to change in ways that surprised both them and the human crew. They started taking photographs of their experiences and keeping written records of conversations and events that they found meaningful. They began celebrating small daily accomplishments rather than taking their eternal existence for granted. Most surprisingly, they started forming emotional attachments to individual crew members rather than viewing all humans as interchangeable examples of their species. Veleth developed a close friendship with Dr. Hayes and began expressing concern for her health and safety in ways that no Xenarathi had ever experienced before. Thyra started creating art inspired by human music and poetry that dealt with themes of temporary beauty and the value of limited time. Kyreth began keeping a journal where the ambassador recorded thoughts and feelings about the journey and the relationships formed with human crew members. The transformation of the three Xenarathi showed both species that exposure to mortality could change even immortal beings in fundamental ways. By the time Earth appeared on the ship sensors, the aliens had gained something they had never possessed before, which was an appreciation for the preciousness of individual moments and relationships. The New Horizon approached Earth after 8 months of traveling through space with 3 Xenarathi crew members who had been forever changed by their exposure to human mortality. Captain Jake Morrison watched from the bridge as his home planet grew larger on the main screen, while reflecting on how much had changed since they first encountered the immortal aliens. The journey that had begun as a simple exploration mission had become something far more significant for both species. Ambassador Kyreth stood beside Jake on the bridge and looked at Earth with eyes that now saw beauty in temporary things. The ambassador had spent months learning to appreciate moments that would pass rather than focusing only on eternal concepts that never changed. Kyreth had discovered that watching a sunset was more meaningful when you understood that each sunset was unique and would never happen exactly the same way again. The arrival at Earth Station brought together diplomats and scientists from across human space who wanted to meet the first immortal aliens ever encountered by humanity. The welcoming ceremony was held in the main conference hall of Luna Station, where representatives from Earth and the outer colonies gathered to hear about the historic first contact. Jake gave a detailed report about the Xenarathi civilization while Kyreth spoke about what the aliens had learned from their time with humans. Dr. Lisa Hayes presented her scientific findings about Xenarathi biology and the implications of their immortality for human understanding of life and aging. Her research suggested that the energy-based nature of Xenarathi existence made them fundamentally different from biological life forms, but that they still experienced emotions and formed relationships in ways that humans could understand and relate to. Maria Santos shared recordings of Xenarathi music and art that had been created during the journey home. The alien composition showed clear influence from human themes about temporary beauty and the value of limited time. Thyros had created works that combined Xenarathi energy manipulation techniques with human concepts about preserving precious moments before they disappeared forever. The most surprising part of the presentation came when Kireth announced that the three Xenarathi had made a decision that would shock both species. They had asked human scientists to help them develop a way to experience mortality themselves. The immortal beings wanted to understand what it meant to live with the knowledge that existence could end, and they were willing to give up their eternal life to gain that understanding. Jake listened with amazement as Kireth explained that the Xenarathi had realized their immortality might actually be a limitation rather than a gift. Living forever had prevented them from understanding the urgency and meaning that came with limited time. They had observed how humans accomplished great things and formed deep relationships, precisely because they knew their opportunities would not last forever. The human scientists in the audience asked many questions about whether such a transformation was even possible given the fundamental differences between human and Xenarathi biology. Dr. Hayes explained that the aliens existed as stable energy patterns rather than biological organisms, so creating mortality for them would require finding ways to introduce instability into their energy-based existence. Velith joined the discussion to explain that some Xenarathi technology could potentially be modified to create aging processes similar to what humans experience naturally. The aliens had devices that could manipulate energy patterns in controlled ways, and these might be adapted to gradually reduce the stability that made Xenarathi immortal. The process would be irreversible once started, and would lead to natural death after a predetermined lifespan. The announcement that immortal beings wanted to become mortal created intense debate among human philosophers and ethicists. Some argued that helping the Xenarathi become mortal was wrong, because it would destroy something precious and irreplaceable. Others believed that respecting the aliens' right to choose their own form of existence was more important than preserving their immortality against their wishes. Kireth addressed these concerns by explaining that the choice to become mortal was not about rejecting Xenarathi nature but about embracing a fuller understanding of existence itself. The ambassador said that immortality without understanding mortality was incomplete, just as mortality without appreciating its meaning was wasted. The three Xenarathi wanted to experience the complete spectrum of existence, including its ending. The debate continued for weeks while human and Xenarathi scientists worked together to determine if creating Xenarathi mortality was technically possible. Jake found himself caught between admiring the aliens' courage and worrying about the implications of their decision. He had taught them about the value of mortal life, but he had not expected them to want to experience it. Personally, during the final diplomatic ceremony before the Xenarathi delegation returned to their homeworld, something unprecedented happened. Kireth announced that the three aliens had decided to share their newfound understanding with their entire civilization. They would return to Valthera not just as observers who had studied mortality, but as advocates for giving other Xenarathi the choice to experience limited existence. The farewell ceremony at the spaceport became a celebration of the exchange of knowledge and understanding between two very different species. Jake embraced each of the three Xenarathi in turn, while knowing that this physical gesture of goodbye had meaning that it would not have possessed before their time together. The aliens had learned to value temporary connections, and the humans had learned that their mortal existence offered gifts that even immortal beings envied. Kireth spoke final words to the assembled crowd of humans and Xenarathi that summarized everything both species had learned from their encounter. The ambassador said that death was not the opposite of life, but rather what gave life its complete meaning. Without endings, there could be no beginnings, and without loss, there could be no appreciation for what was gained. As the Xenarathi transport ship disappeared into the stars, Jake realized that humanity had given the immortal aliens something they had never possessed before, which was the knowledge that temporary things could be more valuable than eternal ones. In return, the Xenarathi had given humanity proof that their brief mortal existence was so meaningful that beings who had lived forever were willing to give up immortality to understand it fully. Years passed, and Jake received regular communications from Kireth describing how Xenarathi society was changing as more aliens chose to experience mortality. The immortal civilization was slowly becoming something new, as its members learned to value limited time and temporary relationships. Jake aged and eventually faced his own mortality, with the knowledge that his brief life had helped immortal beings discover the meaning of goodbye and the courage to say it.